Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got another video in our ship comparison series. This one was suggested by a viewer who gave us a donation to review his hometown ship. So we're going to compare the USS Portland, a World War II heavy cruiser, to Battleship New Jersey. Portland is one of the so-called tin-clad cruisers. They're treaty heavy cruisers, which means that they're limited to 10,000 tons displacement, 8-inch guns, and that doesn't leave much room for armor plate. The U.S. Navy was deficient in cruisers habitually during the Steel Navy era up until World War II. And so finally in the late 20s, early 30s, after waiting for other countries to build their first treaty cruisers, the United States decides that let's start building them in big batches. So they start with the Pensacola and Salt Lake City, and the calculations roll off, and these ships ended up being about 1,000 tons underweight. So they had a good armament, they had the speed that the Navy wanted, but they were really lacking in armor. So the Navy said, okay, we screwed that up. The next class, the 6-ship Northampton class, going to get it right. They came in about 1,000 tons underweight again, despite upping the armor. They dropped the ships from 4 turrets to 3 turrets, and so that bought them some extra displacement. They still came in massively underweight, so American cruisers continued to be lighter than foreign cruisers, and significantly lighter than Japanese cruisers that just ignored the treaties altogether. So the Navy decided, all right, building 5 cruisers this time, it's going to be right. So that was the Portland class. And so they authorized these ships to 3 different shipyards, 1 government yard and 2 private yards. And while they were finishing the plans for the Portland class, they're already developing plans for a new class of cruiser, which would become the New Orleans class. And basically, the New Orleans class, the Navy finally figures it out and has an appropriate amount of armor and comes close to 10,000 tons. And they realize that they're way off with the Portlands, so they're able to completely change the contracts for the Navy Yard ships, the 3 that were being built in Navy yards, and they just become more of the New Orleans class, which will eventually be some 6 ships. The 2 private yard ships, the USS Indianapolis being built right here in Camden at New York Ship, and the USS Portland being built in Quincy, Massachusetts at the Fore River Shipyard, could only be slightly altered. So the Navy was able to look at them and say, all right, we've initially got 1 inch of belt armor, 1 inch of deck armor. If we've got an extra 1,000 tons, we can up that to 2.5 inches of deck, and we can up that to 2.5 inches of deck and up to 5 inches of belt armor. And these will be significantly more protected than the earlier tin-clads, but they'll still be a little bit weaker than the succeeding New Orleans class. So while we're talking about Fore River Shipyard, Battleship New Jersey is going to be in Quincy, Massachusetts, very near the former Fore River Shipyard, on board the museum to that shipyard, which is on the last heavy cruiser anywhere in existence in the world, the heavy cruiser Salem. So if you would like to meet us and maybe join us while we're filming some videos on Salem, be sure to come out on November 6th, which is a Saturday, when we'll be on board. You can meet us with a regular ticket admission price. We'll be on board just about all day. So check their hours on their website, USS Salem. Just Google them and it'll take you to their website. You can buy the ticket right there online. There's also a link in the description below. And hopefully I'll see you there. So Portland is one of the many Fore River built cruisers, and she clocks in around 610 feet long, which is just a little bit longer than earlier cruisers and just a little bit shorter than the older standard type battleships. However, she's got an extremely high length to beam ratio. She's only 66 feet wide. And she draws an average of about 17 feet of water. The max is around 24 feet. So a relatively shallow ship, and although she's long, she's very narrow. So this leads to the biggest design change that you can see between her and the earlier Northampton and Pensacola class cruisers. And thank God they did this. The earlier cruisers had extremely tall tripod masts, like ridiculously tall. So they look like really unbalanced designs. And the Navy calculated that the Portlands were going to be really unbalanced designs. So they designed a much shorter tripod that is far more aesthetically pleasing. In my opinion, the Portland class is the most visually appealing of all of the treaty cruisers that the U.S. Navy builds. They don't have the really tall tripods. They don't have the ugly Citadel-type superstructures that British ships and the New Orleanses have. They aren't turret farms like the Brooklyn class, and they aren't whatever the Omaha class is. So the Navy comes up with a pretty attractive design, much better than earlier cruisers, though not as good as the other contemporaries being built. Fairly close to what contemporary cruisers are doing. With 9 8-inch guns, they tend to have one more barrel than most European nations, and one fewer barrel than the Japanese heavy cruisers then under construction. Their armor is pretty much on par with what everyone else has, level of protection. Their main drawback is everybody else's heavy cruisers are being armed with torpedoes. And by this point, American cruisers were either designed without them in the case of the Portlands, or had them deleted in the case of the Northamptons. So the thought was, by the time we get into torpedo range, odds are these ships have been hit by gunnery repeatedly, and that's probably exploded the exposed torpedoes, causing the loss of the ship. The Japanese had developed extremely long-range torpedoes, and so they carried torpedo tubes in high numbers and used them to deadly effectiveness. And so the American ships can't quite compare with firepower there, but it was probably for the best. The American ships do tend to take the first hits, and so it's good that they're able to survive those hits and dish out damage in return. So it cost just under $11 million to build this ship. It took from between 1930 and 1933 for her to be constructed and then commissioned. And basically, right after she was commissioned, the airship Akron goes down not too far from where Portland was. So in just 36 minutes, the BTs on Portland are able to get up ahead of steam. And so Portland arrives on scene of the crashed dirigible faster than anyone else. And so she coordinates the search and rescue efforts from that point out. So this is really her first job as a U.S. Navy warship during the interwar years. And it turns out that dirigibles would prove unsurvivable, and so they were not used to scout for the fleet during World War II. But ships like Portland were designed to. So Portland had a pair of catapults and at least 4 aircraft that she could carry, which is more than the battleships carried. And unlike with the battleships where the aircraft were just spotting, these were envisioned to be scouting for the fleet. Portland's armament grew throughout her career. She always had 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns. She always had 8 5-inch guns in single open pedestal mounts behind splinter shields. And by the end of the war, she would have 24 40mm guns in a mix of quad and twin mounts, and 17 20mm guns. So being a pre-war construction with a limited displacement, there wasn't a huge amount of growth. She doesn't have quite as many guns as some of the later ships would have added, but still a pretty good anti-aircraft battery. And at the beginning of the war, when she sees some of the fiercest fighting, it's a really good battery. Portland is famous because she earned the 7th most number of battle stars during World War II. And for her World War II service, she earned 7 more battle stars than Battleship New Jersey. So she has 16 battle stars total over her career, all of them from World War II. Her crew was about 800. That's peacetime. It would balloon to about 950 in wartime, and all the way up to about 1,230 when a flag officer was on board. And both Portland and Indianapolis were set up to have flag officers on board. Portland often had the division flag officer on board, and Indianapolis often had a fleet flag officer on board. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who served on board Battleship New Jersey on 2 separate occasions, also liked using Indianapolis as his flagship. So the cruisers, with their high speed, made really excellent flagships. The Admiral could take them in and out of formation as needed. So, when World War II begins, Portland is not in Pearl Harbor, although she's assigned to the Pacific Fleet. She's escorting the aircraft carrier Lexington. When she comes back to port, she joins up with Task Force 17, which is escorting Yorktown. And so she operates with Yorktown through the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway, providing vital anti-aircraft support that keeps Yorktown afloat through repeated air attacks. Portland also rescues the survivors of Lexington when she is lost to Coral Sea, and survivors from Yorktown when she is finally sunk shortly after the main fighting at Midway. From there, she's thrown into the Guadalcanal Campaign. She supports Enterprise during the Santa Cruz operations, and during this battle, she receives her first damage. Not from enemy hits, but from enemy action. One of her 1.1-inch Chicago Piano anti-aircraft guns blows up and kills some crew, and another one of her anti-aircraft guns depresses too low, fires into its own gun shield, and causes the splinters from that to come back into their own gun crew. So these are the first combat fatalities on board. She would next continue to operate around the Solomon Islands. At this point, the aircraft carriers have largely pulled out, and the US and Japanese are throwing increased numbers of their treaty cruisers into the fighting around Guadalcanal. During World War I, everybody had modern dreadnought battleships, and they had pre-dreadnought battleships to throw in as disposable units. So like during the Guadalcanal Campaign, when you needed shore bombardment, you kept the battleships as your battle fleet, and you throw in these pre-dreadnoughts as your disposable units. Well, the Washington Naval Treaty gets rid of all of those disposable vessels, and so any battleships you have are your core battle line, and your tin-clad cruisers end up being your disposable vessels that you throw in to situations where things aren't great. So the United States throws Portland, along with a number of other tin-clad cruisers, into the slot Iron Bottom Sound around Guadalcanal in the central Solomon Islands. And there she is supposed to fight Japanese cruisers and destroyers in night fighting, in close combat with torpedoes flying everywhere. And, not to spoil too much, but Portland is one of the ships that makes it out of this. She is present during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, in which 2 Japanese battleships, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, come down the slot to bombard Henderson Field. And Admiral Dan Callahan has a scratch force of cruisers and destroyers that he's been able to take off of convoy escorts and carrier escort groups to try and stop this bombardment. So Portland is one of the ships involved. If you want to hear more about the naval battle of Guadalcanal, we've got a link in the description to a much older video we did on it. Portland is involved, but relatively early in the action, she's hit in the stern by a Japanese long-lance torpedo fired from a Japanese destroyer. So that torpedo damages her 2 inboard propeller shafts and jams her rudder and her after turret. So basically, the ship is moving much slower than normal. She can only make starboard circles, and she can only fire her forward guns. And she can only fire those guns when they actually bear on enemy ships. So Portland basically continues circling throughout the battle to avoid further torpedo hits, and fires on enemy ships whenever she can come around to bear on them. So this includes the Japanese battleship Hiei, which she is able to bear on at least one occasion and fire several 6-shot salvos on. Fortunately, her 8-inch armor-piercing rounds at that range in darkness were able to do significant damage to the Japanese battleship, and eventually Hiei would be lost, thanks in part to the hits scored by Portland and a number of other ships, many of which were lost during the engagement. In the morning, when the sun comes up, Portland is one of the few ships that couldn't escape iron bottom sound under her own power. She's still sitting there doing circles, and she sees the disabled Japanese destroyer Yaduchi sitting there stationary and fires on her until she explodes. So at this point, there are no more enemy ships within view, and eventually Portland is able to limp back into port and get towed away for 6 months of repairs. When she re-enters the war, it is a much less fair fight than it was on Guadalcanal. And so she serves briefly in the Aleutians Campaign, through the Gilberts and Marshalls Campaign, in the Caroline Islands, during the invasion of Leyte Gulf, where she participates in the Battle of Suragawa Strait and does significant damage to the Japanese heavy cruiser Mogami, and then the Okinawa invasion. And throughout all this time, she's escorting carriers, she's doing shore bombardment, the normal stuff that pretty much any American ship was doing at this point in the war. When the war ends, she participates in Operation Magic Carpet and transports 600 service members back to the United States. And she arrives in Portland, Maine by Navy Day, October 27th, and is able to represent the U.S. Navy in her hometown on that occasion. Shortly after the war, she's decommissioned. She's held in reserves for about a decade, and surprisingly, despite her decorations and her storied service life, and despite the fact that other museum ships were opening up at that time, there doesn't appear to be any effort to convert her to a museum ship, and she's sold for scrap and eventually broken up in the late 1950s. So that is the service life of the heavy cruiser Portland, named after Portland, Maine, not Portland, Oregon. So how does she compare to New Jersey? She's significantly smaller at 10,000 tons. Her 9 8-inch guns are half the size of New Jersey's. But her service life is much more involved during World War II than New Jersey's. She sees some really tough fighting, especially around the Solomon Islands, an area where the U.S. Navy would not have committed the Iowa-class battleships, even had they been available, in my opinion. And so I would say that Portland compares very favorably to New Jersey. Obviously, if the two ships are stacked side by side, New Jersey is infinitely more powerful in every respect: armor, speed, guns, command and control facilities. Any way you measure these two ships, New Jersey is better. She has greater range. There are very few statistics that you could look at. Portland might have a tighter turning radius. There isn't much that Portland does that stacks up 1-for-1 with New Jersey, but Portland only weighs 1/5 what New Jersey does, and she's about 1/10 as expensive, although she only has about half the crew size. So the U.S. Navy committed significantly fewer resources to Portland, and that meant that they were willing to commit Portland to more dangerous situations. And that means, I believe, that they got more use out of her, at least during World War II. When these two ships were in operation together, the Navy was getting more use out of Portland than they were out of New Jersey. Now, at the end of the day, the Iowa-class battleships, because of their great size and being the last of their kind, are kept in service much longer than the Portland-class cruisers. And so, end of the day, the Navy maybe gets more use out of the Iowas. But just looking at World War II, the Portlands probably contributed more to the American victory than the Iowas did. So, which ship do you think contributed more? Let us know in the comment section down below. Also, let us know if there's any ships you'd like to see in a future ship comparison video. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals. For example, today's video was funded by somebody who wanted to see this topic made. So we really appreciate that support. There's a link below in the description for ways you can donate. You can also support the museum by liking, sharing, and subscribing so that more people find out about our content. Thanks for watching.